My name is Daniel Crossley. I'm the Sales Engineering Manager for the UK at LogRhythm, and thank you for joining my session. Across the next 30 minutes, I'm going to be sharing with you 3 key techniques that threat actors will use on your network. Firstly, a little bit about myself. I work for LogRhythm. I've worked for LogRhythm for almost 3 years now. I've got a background working for SIEM vendors. Prior to this, I was at McAfee. Prior to that, I was at Huntsman. And I actually started my career working as a network engineer for a number of large ISPs. Please connect on LinkedIn. I try to share threat detection tips whenever I can. And if you have any questions on any of the content that we covered today, please reach out to me directly, or don't hesitate to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. So what are we going to cover today? As I said, I wanted to share with you 3 key techniques that threat actors will commonly use when they are breaching an infrastructure. I think it's important to understand how the techniques such as these operate, because then that would lead us to an understanding of how we could go about potentially detecting them. So the 3 techniques specifically are C2, which is the shortened version for command and control. So a bit of an overview of how the C2 communications and infrastructure might work. Next, domain generation algorithms, otherwise known as DGAs, and these are important for attackers and very often embedded in malware, and these facilitate this C2 communications. Thirdly, data exfiltration. There are so many ways to perform data exfiltration, so today we're just going to talk about one, and that is data exfiltration via DNS tunneling. And all 3 of these, as I said, all 3 of these techniques are very commonly used in recent breaches, and I think it's important to understand how they work, because that could lead us to an understanding of how we could go about detecting them. All 3 of these can be very difficult to detect if the attacker is sophisticated enough. So a little bit of background as to the why. I think it was clear to everyone that the year 2020 was certainly a big one when it comes to cybersecurity news. There were a number of high-profile global enterprise organizations breached and held to ransom. One of those in the top right-hand corner was Garmin. They were unfortunately affected by a ransomware attack, which actually took a lot of their services offline, including their running app. Garmin they do many things, and one of their lines of business is fitness tracking devices. And this is actually a screenshot from my own Garmin app, and it was down for around about 6 days, which says to me that the attack, or the infrastructure that was affected by the ransomware, there was quite a lot of infrastructure affected by the ransomware. 2020 obviously ended with the big one, and this was the SolarWinds breach. And this is where a very sophisticated attacker breached a trust infrastructure to insert their C2 implant, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, within the SolarWinds source code, and that was then pushed out to SolarWinds customers and enabled widespread access to a number of environments for this threat actor. It was a very sophisticated, very well-planned attack that took place at the end there of 2020. And 2021 looks to be no different. Cyberpunk 2077, some of you might know what that is. It's a video game that's fairly recent, quite popular. The developer CD Projekt Red was very recently affected by ransomware, and in this particular case, held the source code for some of their existing and unreleased video games up for auction on the internet, as well as encrypting a number of their critical machines. So the cleanup, and I think the overall organizational impact to that particular attack, is going to be quite significant for CD Projekt Red. So I think it's clear to see that 2021 isn't going to be any different. Each one of these attacks were on large enterprise organizations that had appropriate security controls in place, that undoubtedly were mature in their operations, their security operations, and probably had things like 24/7 security operation centers, and were undoubtedly mandated by regulation. And the other problem is malware. I'm not talking about the kind of malware that is commodity and gets picked up by our standard antivirus. I'm talking about the type of malware that is custom, either custom written or custom compiled, evades our endpoint detections, evades our other controls, such as our antivirus. And in a lot of cases, in fact, in almost all cases of significant breaches, the attackers have leveraged malware in some form or another. And if it evades our detections or our controls on the endpoints, then we do have a possibility of picking this up as it traverses the network and as it operates on the network. And really that is the objective of the session today, is to cover some of the techniques that malware and attackers will use while on the network. Now that was just a little bit of scene setting, so let's dive into it. As I said at the start, there are three key techniques that we're going to be talking about today. The first one is a MITRE tactic, and that is called command and control, otherwise known as C2. This is a fairly generic term to describe a situation where an attacker has set up a network infrastructure and is leveraging that offensively to gain access to an organization's environment. Now, how would they do this? So as I said, command and control, it consists of techniques that adversaries will use to communicate with systems under their control and within a victim's network. And by a victim, I mean a target organization such as Garmin, CD Projekt Red, SolarWinds, so on and so forth. Adversaries leveraging C2 techniques will often attempt to mimic normal and expected traffic. There are also many ways an adversary can establish command and control, and there are many various levels of sophistication and stealth. Now, how does command and control work? Well, the attacker goal when establishing command and control is to gain access to a system on the inside of a network. The problem that they have is that the attacker generally can't get through the firewall from the outside. So these are our standard perimeter defenses that we've had for a number of decades, ring-fenced by a firewall. So the general solution to this, and this is highly simplified, but I hope to give you an understanding. The general solution to this is tricking a user into installing what's called a C2 implant. That C2 implant will initiate an outbound connection from their workstation. Once this connection is established, the attacker will then have access to the inside. Now, there's a bit more to it than this, but this is an overview. The idea of the session is to give you an overview of how these things work. Now, in some cases, when it comes to tricking the user, very often this is performed by some kind of social engineering attack or a phishing email. If a user clicks the link, it could take them to an infected website, which will then exploit a vulnerability to install the C2 implant. There are other mechanisms by which an attacker can trick a user to installing a C2 implant. Otherwise, the user could just visit a infected or malicious website and have that C2 implant installed. Otherwise, an attacker could leverage vulnerabilities or exploit vulnerabilities in software to install that C2 implant. But once that is actually installed, the key thing here is that the implant itself is making an outbound connection. So therefore, the attacker doesn't need to come in through the firewall because the connection is going to reach them from the inside. This may work in a number of different ways. What is very common is for the C2 implants to perform some kind of beaconing activity. And by this, what I mean is over some kind of scheduled interval, and it may not always be a static interval, it could be a random interval. The C2 implant will reach out to a predefined destination, which is actually controlled by the attacker. On each period that the implant reaches out, it will be looking for some kind of commands to then, which the attacker will issue to it, and then it can go ahead and perform those commands. And by that I mean things like performing perhaps local reconnaissance on the user's workstation to figure out what's around them, maybe extracting any kinds of credentials that may exist on the local system, and just generally looking to pivot within the environment. So this could all happen on a beaconing basis, whereby the implant will be taking commands from the attacker through its beaconing activities. The attacker will be issuing commands, and the implant would pick those up each time it connects via its beacon. The attacker could also leverage the C2 implant to install secondary payloads. These could be things like additional command and control components. They could be additional pieces of malware or anything really that would allow the attacker to gain some level of persistence within the environment. By persistence, I mean the C2 implant will be the initial foothold, and shortly after that, the attacker would want to establish some level of permanent access to that environment, just in case the C2 implants were somehow to be detected. Now, on the side of the attacker, it's not always the case that the connection goes directly to them. In fact, almost never in modern C2 architectures, the attacker would actually control a number of systems, usually hosted in something like a cloud environment. And these would be dynamic systems, and they're likely changing every day. And they'll be dynamic so that the attacker will make it very difficult to detect the infrastructure that they are actually using. So let's look at this in the context of a supply chain attack, specifically SolarWinds. Again, in a very highly simplified way, what has happened here and what can happen in the case of a supply chain attack is an attacker will breach an existing trust infrastructure, and then they would use that to install multiple C2 implants. So in the case of SolarWinds, what actually happened is the attacker breached the SolarWinds environment, which is listed there. They were able to insert their C2 implant code stealthily into the build process of the SolarWinds software, so that when the SolarWinds product known as Orion updated the software at each one of its own customer sites listed there or shown there on the left hand side of the screen, what it actually meant was that the C2 implant was surreptitiously or stealthily installed at each one of the SolarWinds Orion customers' environments, and then after a set period of 2 weeks, the C2 implant would actually lie dormant for 2 weeks, and then after that it would start to beacon out to the attacker. Again, it was via a fairly convoluted infrastructure hosted in the cloud environment to make the attacker untraceable. However, that is in essence how the supply chain attack happened in the context of SolarWinds. So this is an issue. When it comes to the attacker, the dilemma, or the attacker's dilemma, is that any detection along the attack sequence could actually result in the unraveling of the entire attack. So when it comes to detecting C2, I think the things that we need to think about is how do we go about detecting this? Where are the gaps in our detection coverage? Because there are many different ways the C2 can be put in place and many different ways that communication channel can operate. So I think it's important to have multiple layers of detection, otherwise known as detection depth or overlapping fields of visibility across our network, to allow us to identify normal behavior of our network traffic, which will then ultimately allow us to identify where there may be anomalous traffic that could be representative of C2. Aside from that, there are many security controls that can be put in place on the network to actually allow you to identify C2. Things like IOC matching, IPS of course, web proxies, so on and so forth. But also in a lot of cases, I think it's important to have an additional layer of detection that identifies or baselines your network traffic, your normal network traffic. And I think that would actually help you to identify when there might be potential C2 activity taking place, such as the beaconing, which I talked about earlier. Now, the next area that I want to talk about is DGA, otherwise known as domain generation algorithms. What they are, how they work, and how we could think about going about detecting these kinds of activities. So first of all, what is a DGA, domain generation algorithm? Well, ultimately, this is a mechanism that attackers will use and malware will use. Essentially, the attackers will embed a DGA within a piece of malware to evade detection. If we think about the C2 implant that I talked about earlier, that needs to be able to reach out to the attacker. The attacker needs to have an endpoint that is accessible over the public internet. And generally the way they would do this is by hosting a domain. And a domain is literally equivalent to a website that you would go to. Let's say we go to www.google.com. Google.com is the domain for the website you're visiting. Now, in essence, what a attacker will do is host a very specific domain, and that domain will be accessible on the internet. And when that C2 implant is installed and needs to connect out to the attacker, they would generally, in some cases, not all cases, they would connect via the domain. Now, this presents a problem for the attacker, because if they're hosting a domain, it can be very easy for that domain to be identified, shared via threat intelligence sharing, appear on various IOC lists, and also just generally get blocked and or taken down by law enforcement. So what attackers will do then is host multiple domains over the course of multiple days, and this is where the dynamic element comes into it. Okay, so they would host a domain for a day, take that down, and then host another one, take that down, host another one as well. So what a DGA does, it provides them with a dynamic way of hosting multiple domains such that they don't have a static domain that can be blocked and actually is very difficult for law enforcement to take down, but it also makes it very difficult to detect. Now, on the C2 implant side, it needs to know what to connect out to. So this is the DGA itself. So the DGA exists in the C2 implant, and the C2 implant will dynamically generate a whole bunch of domain names, most of them looking fairly random, and then try to connect out to maybe 1,000 a day. Only one or a couple of these will actually be online for that given day because the attacker knows what the domains are that the malware is going to generate. Are you with me? Now, what this actually is a Python script on the left-hand side. Don't try to understand it, but really, I just want to say that a DGA, by showing you this, a DGA really is only a couple of lines of Python code, or it can consist of a couple of lines of Python code. In which case, in this particular example, this is based on a real DGA, based on a banking Trojan. And essentially what it does, it just shuffles the first 6 characters in that seed. So you can see the seed there that ends in the .com. So it's the first 6 or so characters that get shuffled, and what that means is the DGA just generates this list of random looking domains, right? They look fairly similar at the end, but the first part is random. It could generate thousands of these. It will try to connect to a small subset of these, and generally only of that subset, maybe only a very, very small subset would actually be online and listening. But that would be the way that the malware goes out and connects with the attacker. There are other techniques that attackers use in this process, such as fast flux, but at its core, what we've got here is a piece of malware that is reaching out to numerous non-existent domains, and this is why it's so difficult to detect, because these are fully formed kind of DNS requests. There's nothing suspicious about it on the outset, apart from the fact that we're reaching out to numerous random domains. So that is in part why they can be so difficult to stop and detect. And in fact, detection approaches that are based on baselining and machine learning have tended to be the most successful. So here is an example of a packet capture showing you the traffic that is traversing from an infected machine and the types of the domains that are being reached out to. Again, a lot of these are non-existent. This is an example of the Sunburst domain generation algorithm, or the DGA that was embedded in the Sunburst malware. And the Sunburst malware is important because it was actually part of the SolarWinds breach that I just talked about. Okay, it's actually the Sunburst malware that was embedded in the Orion software as a backdoor. And what this actually does, just out of interest, is not only does it dynamically generate these lists of domains, but actually it bases it on some attributes of the system itself that it's installed on. So therefore the attackers can decode that particular string, and it will give them instantly some information on the machine that the malware is actually installed on, including the domain name. And in actual fact, this is how the malware authors knew which organizations that they would target, just by going by the information that was provided to them by the malware via the DGA. So again, this can be very, very difficult to detect, but one particular approach is by looking at the normal behavior of DNS traffic and just network traffic traversing your network and looking for anomalies beyond that. So these are some of the ways that you could go about detecting DGA activity. Now, it's important to understand how DGA activities work, because if we understand how DGA activities work and we see this kind of activity happening in our log files, then it gives us a better chance of understanding of when this is happening in our own environment. Okay, so that is how a DGA works. And again, DGA is very common in many different types of malware, and it is very often the initial way that a piece of malware or the C2 implant will perform that initial connection back to the attacker's infrastructure. Now, the last technique that I want to cover off today is data exfiltration. Now, there's a number of different ways that attackers can exfiltrate data from an environment. So today we're just going to be focused on DNS, and you can see the MITRE technique there if you wanted to know more about this particular technique. But let's dive into it. So why data exfiltration and why DNS? Well, data exfiltration really is a catch-all term used to refer to a situation where an attacker or an intruder or a malicious insider will exfiltrate data, usually sensitive data from an environment. A good example is going back to the start of the session today where I talked about the hack on CD Projekt Red. The source code for a number of their video games was actually exfiltrated from their environment. So that's an example of data exfiltration. And there's a number of different ways this can be achieved, but using the DNS protocol actually gives attackers a mechanism to exchange data without a direct connection. So this actually makes DNS a very good covert channel, coupled by the fact that DNS is often allowed to pass a network and is often not inspected to the same level as other types of network traffic are. There are new controls in place, such as DNS firewalls, so on and so forth. But generally speaking, traffic analysis can be used to detect DNS tunneling, or any kind of tunneling for that matter, based on the characteristics of the overall traffic. And what I mean by that is going back to what I've said earlier, and that is having some kind of understanding of your normal behavior of your network will give you the ability to detect outliers in behavior and flag anomalies. Okay, so how does DNS traffic work? How does data exfiltration via DNS work? Well, I've also referred to it as DNS tunneling. And essentially what this means is we are sending sensitive information, or an attacker is sending sensitive information using the DNS protocol. The DNS protocol wasn't originally designed for data exfiltration. It's designed for domain name resolution. Okay, however, creative attackers have repurposed this. So the way that it works is that, one example of the way that this works is that the attacker can package data. Now again, this is something that kind of happens towards the late stage of an attack. So those things that I talked about before, the attacker has established a command and control infrastructure. They have established communications with systems on the inside via C2 implants that potentially use DGAs. They might have spent some time performing local reconnaissance and actually pivoting to systems that might hold things like source code. Now they want to exfiltrate that. So they could potentially use DNS to do that by packaging the data and actually sending it in a TXT record of a custom DNS request to a domain that they actually own. What that then means is you would have the internal DNS server and a recursive DNS server, probably owned by the ISP, would send that to an authoritative DNS server. And this is a server that is actually owned by the attacker. So the attacker would receive these TCP packets, these DNS packets, which actually use the UDP protocol. And they can then essentially stitch the data together. Now it's not always straightforward. This is a UDP protocol, so it means it is lossy, and any loss of packets means that they might not be able to fully reconstruct the data. However, it is a mechanism which has been used in the past. Now, if we look at what this looks like over the network, in this particular case, we've got data that is being sent as a part of the TXT record, which this record type wasn't designed to hold data, and it's got a very limited amount of bytes that you can put in there, but it can hold data. And what would happen is an attacker would be able to send a file, but first they would typically encrypt it, first of all, so you can't see what the actual data is. Then they'll need to encode it and then break it down into chunks. But if those chunks are small enough, they could be fit within a valid DNS packet, and that's another reason why this is so difficult to detect, because the packets are leveraging standard DNS packets, standard DNS protocols. We don't have any protocol anomalies here, apart from the extra long TXT record, which is one way organizations can threat hunt for this, is actually looking for abnormally long TXT records. But in general, any kind of data exfiltration, there are numerous mechanisms to perform this. So therefore, our general recommendation is to have overlapping controls and overlapping fields of visibility. And once you've got that in place, to potentially perform a level of analysis where you are baselining your network behavior, and off that baseline then identifying potential anomalies, right? So in this case, it could be large amounts of data sent, or abnormally long or abnormally large DNS requests being sent. I've got it down there. The detection can be based on protocol inspection, uncommon data flows, or large amounts of data being transferred. Also, DNS traffic to or from suspicious domains. All of these can be particular detection points. Now, in the last few minutes or so, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to you MISSNET NDR, which is actually a recent acquisition made by LogRhythm. So MISSNET is a network detection and response platform that actually will perform network traffic analysis and response for your environment, ranging from your north to south traffic, your east to west traffic, as well as in the cloud. Now, MISSNET is actually based on a number of different detection engines, and part of the principle of MISSNET is to actually qualify network detections or anomalies on your network by correlating anomalous network traffic with other detection engines such as an IPS and a rule-based engine to actually provide security analysts with a qualified alert or a very small amount of qualified incidents. So in the case of a DGA, we could use a distributed analytics engine correlated with detections from a rules engine to provide us with a fully qualified incident. DGA, as I said, detection can be quite difficult, but in this case, we could actually detect unusual DNS domains as well as an unusual number of DNS NX domain, which is non-existent domain failures, right? Correlated with a rule trigger provided on a timeline gives you the possibility of detecting these kinds of techniques and more based on the baseline of what's happening on your network. So if you'd like to know more, please reach out to me directly. But if you've stayed with me to this point, appreciate your time. Thank you very much. I hope you've got something out of it. Okay, say goodbye, you guys.